It was a crisp autumn evening when Marcus Sterling's Bentley Continental GT decided to give up on him in the middle of nowhere. As CEO of Sterling Innovations, a tech empire worth billions, Marcus was used to things working perfectly: his schedule, his investments, his life. At 45, he had everything money could buy: penthouses in 3 major cities, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as one of Silicon Valley's most ruthless entrepreneurs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sleek black vehicle, which had never failed him before, now sat uselessly on a narrow country road, surrounded by endless cornfields painted golden by the setting sun. Marcus cursed under his breath as he checked his phone. No signal. Of course. He loosened his custom-made Italian silk tie, feeling suffocated by the rural silence that pressed in around him. Through the tinted windows of his car, he could see an old farmhouse in the distance, its weathered red barn and rustic wooden fence a stark contrast to the gleaming modern architecture he was accustomed to. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, suggesting someone was home. As much as it irritated him, he knew he had no choice. He would have to walk there and ask for help, something Marcus Sterling hadn't done in over a decade. Just that morning, he had closed a $500 million deal, acquiring a promising startup that had dared to compete with his company. The young CEO had practically begged him to spare their company culture, to keep their team intact. Marcus had simply smiled, signed the papers, and walked away. By noon, his HR department had already begun the restructuring, corporate speak for systematic dismantling. Just another Tuesday, he had told his executive board, earning knowing chuckles from around the conference table. That's how life worked in his world. You either acquired or got acquired, you either won or lost. There was no middle ground, no room for sentiment or weakness. The setting sun cast long shadows across the deserted road as Marcus popped open his trunk, retrieving a pair of custom-made leather shoes he kept for emergencies. He wasn't about to ruin his John Lobb Oxfords walking through dirt and gravel. As he changed his shoes, a sleek private jet streaked across the darkening sky, probably one of his peers heading to another high-stakes meeting or exclusive retreat. Just 6 hours ago, he had been in a similar jet, reading reports about his latest acquisition, planning his next corporate conquest. Now here he was, stranded in what felt like a different century. His smartwatch, usually buzzing constantly with notifications, was as useless as his phone. The artificial intelligence assistant he had helped develop, the one that managed every aspect of his daily life, couldn't help him here. The irony wasn't lost on him. A tech mogul rendered helpless by simple car trouble. Marcus checked his reflection in the car window, adjusting his perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair. Even in crisis, image was everything. His personal brand consultants had spent years crafting his public persona, the self-made tech titan who had risen from nothing to build an empire. The magazines loved that story, especially the part about his mysterious past before Silicon Valley. Some things are better left in the past, he always told reporters with a practiced smile that discouraged further questions. The truth was, Marcus Sterling hadn't always been Marcus Sterling, but that was a secret buried so deep that not even his most thorough competitors had managed to uncover it. He had made sure of that, spending millions on carefully constructed paper trails and ironclad NDAs. The past was the past, and he intended to keep it that way. As he began the walk toward the farmhouse, his Italian leather briefcase feeling unusually heavy in his hand, Marcus rehearsed the conversation in his head. He would be polite, but distant, professional, but authoritative. He would offer generous compensation for any assistance. Money opened doors, even in places like this. He would get what he needed and be gone, back to his world of glass towers and digital empires. Little did he know that fate had other plans. In just a few minutes, everything he had built, every wall he had carefully constructed around his past, would begin to crumble. And it would all start with what he was about to see in that humble farmhouse's living room. The gravel crunched under his feet as he approached the house, each step taking him closer to a confrontation he didn't know was coming. A confrontation with the one thing his wealth couldn't control, his own past. Marcus approached the farmhouse, his expensive shoes already collecting dust from the gravel path. The closer he got, the more details emerged. Wind chimes made from old mason jars tinkling softly in the evening breeze. A rocking chair gently swaying on the wraparound porch, and beds of wildflowers that somehow managed to bloom despite the approaching autumn. All of it seemed to belong to a different world, a simpler one he had long ago left behind. The porch steps creaked under his weight, each board weathered but solid, speaking to years of careful maintenance. Before he could knock, the screen door opened with a characteristic spring-loaded squeak that transported him, for just a moment, to another time, another place. The sound was so familiar it made him pause, but he quickly dismissed the sensation. In his experience, nostalgia was just another form of weakness. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the doorway, probably in his early 60s, wearing worn jeans and a faded plaid shirt. His face was weathered from years of working outdoors, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Marcus's expensive suit and carefully curated appearance. There was something about those eyes, a certain intensity that made Marcus slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. "Evening," the farmer said, his voice deep and measured. "Looks like you could use some help." He had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who lived by the sun rather than a schedule, so different from the frenetic energy Marcus was used to in his corporate boardrooms. "Yes, my car broke down about a quarter-mile down the road," Marcus replied, unconsciously adopting the slightly condescending tone he used with service personnel. "I was wondering if I could use your phone to call my assistant. I'll compensate you, of course." He reached for his wallet, already pulling out several $100 bills. The farmer's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Was it amusement? "Phone lines are down from the storm last night," he said. "But come on in. Maybe we can figure something out." He stepped aside, holding the screen door open. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the farmhouse. The interior was exactly what he expected. Simple furniture, well-worn but clean. Family photos on the walls. A slight scent of wood smoke from the fireplace. It was the kind of place he would normally avoid. Too rural, too ordinary, too real. But then he saw it, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. There, above the fireplace in a simple wooden frame that had seen better days, was a Medal of Honor. The highest military decoration possible. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just any Medal of Honor, he recognized the exact pattern of scratches on the metal surface, the slight discoloration on the blue ribbon. He should recognize it. He had earned it. 15 years ago, before he became Marcus Sterling, before the tech empire and the billions, before he had buried his past so deep he sometimes convinced himself it had never happened. Back when he was Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan, leading a special forces team in Afghanistan. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. His carefully constructed world, built on algorithms and acquisitions, began to crack at the edges. How was this possible? He had lost the medal during his hasty transformation into Marcus Sterling, during those chaotic days when he was running from number. He wouldn't think about that. Not now. Not ever. "Beautiful piece of history, isn't it?" the farmer said quietly, watching Marcus's reaction with those penetrating eyes. "Got it from an old war buddy. Said he found it in a burned-out building in Kandahar. Funny thing is, he could never track down who it belonged to. The original owner just disappeared." Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The farmer's words seemed to echo in his head, mixing with other sounds. Explosions, gunfire, screaming. Memories he had spent a fortune trying to erase came flooding back. I need to leave," Marcus managed to say, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. But as he turned toward the door, he found himself face to face with a photograph on the wall. It showed a group of soldiers in combat gear, dusty and tired but smiling. His heart stopped. He recognized every face in that photo, including his own, younger and somehow more alive, standing next to... He turned back to look at the farmer. Really look at him this time. Strip away 15 years, remove the lines and gray hair, add a combat helmet. "Hello, Mike," the farmer said softly. "Or do you prefer Marcus now? It's been a long time, sir." In that moment, Marcus Sterling, billionaire tech mogul, ruthless corporate raider, self-made success story, felt his carefully constructed reality begin to unravel. The past he had tried so hard to outrun had finally caught up with him, in a humble farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. And it was wearing a faded plaid shirt. Marcus felt his legs go weak, and he gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. The room that had seemed so simple moments ago now felt loaded with ghosts. Every object, the worn furniture, the faded photographs, even the ancient ceiling fan spinning lazily above, seemed to mock his carefully constructed facade. "You're Jimmy Cooper," Marcus finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The name felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. "Corporal James Cooper, 3rd Squad." "Still am," Jimmy replied, moving to an old leather armchair and gesturing for Marcus to sit across from him. "Though these days folks around here just call me Jim. I don't use my rank much anymore. Unlike some people, I didn't feel the need to become someone else entirely." The accusation in those words hung heavy in the air. Marcus remained standing, his CEO instincts kicking in, searching for control of the situation. But this wasn't a hostile takeover or a board meeting. This was something far more dangerous. This was his past, refusing to stay buried. "That mission in Kandahar," Jimmy continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "The one that earned you that medal. The one that changed everything. You never told us why you disappeared afterward. One day you were our commanding officer, the next, poof, gone like a ghost." Marcus's hand unconsciously went to his tie, adjusting it even though it was perfectly straight. It was a nervous tick he thought he'd eliminated years ago. "It's complicated, Cooper. There were circumstances." "Circumstances?" Jimmy's laugh was harsh. "We were your men, sir. Your team. We'd been through hell together, saved each other's lives more times than I can count. And then you vanish? Right after the biggest operation of our deployment? Right after Thompson and Rodriguez died saving your life?" The names hit Marcus like physical blows. Thompson. Rodriguez. He saw their faces in his dreams sometimes, though his army of therapists and meditation coaches had helped him bury those memories deep. Now they came rushing back. Thompson's weird laugh, Rodriguez's terrible jokes, the way they'd both jumped in front of him when the building started to collapse. "I couldn't stay," Marcus said, his carefully cultivated Silicon Valley accent slipping, revealing hints of his original Texas drawl. "After what happened. After what I did." "What you did?" Jimmy leaned forward. "You mean saving that village? Leading the mission that stopped one of the biggest bomb-making operations in the province? Earning the Medal of Honor? Which part of that was so terrible you had to erase yourself?" Marcus finally sank into the chair across from Jimmy. The leather creaked beneath him, and suddenly he was back in the forward operating base, sitting in similar chairs, planning missions with his team. The same team he'd abandoned. "The medal wasn't for saving the village," Marcus said quietly. His words seemed to drop into the room like stones into a deep well. "That's what the official report said, but you know that's not what happened. You were there, Cooper. You saw what I really did." Jimmy's expression changed, the accusation in his eyes softening slightly. "Yeah, I was there. I saw our commanding officer make an impossible choice. I saw him choose to save his men instead of completing the mission. I saw him lie in his report to protect us all. I gave the order to pull back," Marcus continued, his carefully maintained control cracking. We could have stopped that whole network, but the building was coming down. Thompson and Rodriguez were already, and the rest of you would have died if we'd pushed forward. So I called it off. Then I lied. Said we'd completed the mission. Said we'd found the evidence, destroyed the network. They gave me a medal for a victory that never happened. The ceiling fan continued its lazy circles, spreading the scent of wood smoke and memories through the room. Outside, the sun had almost set, casting long shadows across the farmhouse's wooden floors. The brass bought it, Jimmy said. Everyone bought it. You were a hero. So why run? Marcus stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. Because 6 months later, that bomb-making network we failed to stop killed 37 people in Kabul. 37 innocent people died because I chose to save my men instead of completing the mission. Because I was weak. Because I let emotions cloud my judgment. He stopped at the fireplace, staring at the Medal of Honor that had started this whole confrontation. So I ran, changed my name, used some connections, called in every favor I had, became Marcus Sterling, built a life where decisions were clean, mathematical, where emotions didn't matter, where weakness wasn't an option. And how's that working out for you? Jimmy's voice was gentle now, almost pitying. All those billions, all that power, has it helped you sleep any better at night? Before Marcus could answer, a truck's engine rumbled in the driveway. Through the window, he saw a beaten-up Ford pickup coming to a stop. The driver's door opened, and a young man stepped out, his movements eerily familiar. "That'll be my son," Jimmy said, standing up. "Named him Michael, after the best commanding officer I ever had." Marcus felt the last pieces of his carefully constructed world crumble around him. In the fading light of day, standing in a farmhouse he never meant to enter, surrounded by a past he never meant to face, Marcus Sterling finally realized that running from who you are only means you eventually crash into yourself. And sometimes, that crash happens on a quiet country road, when your very expensive car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. The screen door creaked open, and Michael Cooper stepped into the house. At 25, he was almost exactly the age Marcus had been during that fateful mission in Kandahar. The resemblance to his father was striking, but there was something else in his bearing, his posture, that made Marcus's throat tighten. He moved like a soldier. "Dad?" Michael called out, then stopped abruptly when he saw Marcus. His eyes narrowed, taking in the expensive suit, the designer shoes now covered in dust, the carefully maintained appearance of success. But there was something else in his gaze, a flash of recognition that shouldn't have been there. Jimmy cleared his throat. "Michael, this is an old friend." "I know who he is," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying the same steady calm his father's had. "Your picture's still in Dad's old footlocker, Staff Sergeant Sullivan, though I guess it's Mr. Sterling now, right? The tech billionaire?" Marcus felt the room spin slightly. "You know who I am?" Michael moved further into the room, dropping his keys on a side table with practiced ease. "I've known since I was 15. Found Dad's old military photos, started asking questions. Then I saw your face on the cover of Tech Innovator magazine. Same eyes, different name. Wasn't hard to figure out." "Michael's a captain now," Jimmy said, a note of pride in his voice. "Army Rangers, just back from his 3rd deployment." The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. This young man, named after him, had followed in their footsteps, had chosen the same path that Marcus had run from so desperately. "Afghanistan?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Michael nodded. "Among other places. Actually served with some of the units you helped train back in the day. Your tactical innovations are still being taught, you know. The Sullivan maneuver, they call it, though most people don't know who Sullivan was." Marcus sank back into his chair, the weight of the past pressing down on him. All these years, he'd thought he'd erased every trace of Staff Sergeant Sullivan, buried him so deep he'd never be found. But here he was, living on in military textbooks, in war rooms, in the stories passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. Last month, Michael continued, moving to stand by the fireplace next to the Medal of Honor. We were in a situation. Bad intel, civilian presence unknown, high-value target. By the book, we should have gone in. Complete the mission at all costs. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. He knew what was coming. But I remembered the stories Dad told me about you. About Kandahar. About choosing your men over the mission, so I made the call to pull back. Michael turned to face him fully. We lost the target, but I saved my entire team, and 3 days later, we got another chance. Took the target down clean. No casualties. The room fell silent except for the gentle whirring of the ceiling fan. Outside, crickets had begun their evening chorus, a sound so far removed from the chaos of both war and Wall Street. You think you failed that day in Kandahar, Michael said, that choosing to save your men was weak. But you want to know what I think? I think it was the strongest thing you could have done. It's easy to sacrifice people for a mission. It's harder to live with the weight of keeping them alive. Marcus stood up abruptly, moving to the window. The sun had set completely now, leaving the farmland bathed in deep purple twilight. In the distance he could see his Bentley, a dark shape on the country road, as out of place as he felt. I've spent 15 years, he said, his voice rough, building an empire based on the idea that emotion is weakness, that the only thing that matters is the bottom line, the mission, the outcome. He turned back to face them. I've destroyed companies, ruined careers, broken up families, all because it was good business. All because I convinced myself that being hard, being ruthless, was the only way to make up for being weak that day in Kandahar. Jimmy stood up, moving to stand beside his son. You weren't weak, sir, you were human, and maybe that's what's really been eating at you all these years. Not that you failed the mission, but that you succeeded in being human in a moment when it would have been easier to be a machine. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Marcus looked at the father and son standing before him, one from his past, one carrying his name into a future he'd tried to escape. In their faces, he saw everything he'd run from. Honor, loyalty, humanity. The car, he said suddenly. It's not really broken down, is it? Jimmy smiled slightly. Killed the engine remotely when you drove past. Military-grade tech. Amazing what you can do with a good mechanics background and a few friends in interesting places. You've been watching me? Keeping tabs, Jimmy corrected. Making sure you were still in there somewhere, under all that Marcus Sterling armor, waiting for the right moment to remind you of who you really are. Marcus looked at the Medal of Honor one more time, seeing it now not as a symbol of failure, but as a bridge between who he had been and who he had become. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to find out if Marcus Sterling and Staff Sergeant Sullivan could exist in the same space, the same life, the same man. Marcus walked onto the farmhouse porch, the night air cool against his face. Behind him, he could hear Jimmy and Michael moving around in the kitchen, the domestic sounds of coffee being made, cups clinking against saucers. Such normal sounds, so far removed from both the battlefield and the boardroom. Black, 2 sugars, Jimmy called out. That's still how you take it, right? The fact that Jimmy remembered such a small detail from 15 years ago made Marcus's chest tighten. When was the last time anyone had actually made him coffee? His assistant ordered his precisely calibrated espresso drinks from overpriced cafes, and his smart home system brewed his morning cup automatically. But a simple cup of coffee, made by someone who knew how he liked it, that felt like a luxury his billions couldn't buy. Some things don't change, Marcus replied, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. He settled into one of the rocking chairs, the same kind they'd had on their forward operating base in Afghanistan. The rhythmic creaking brought back memories of late-night strategy sessions, of quiet conversations between missions, of moments when he had been both a leader and a human being. Michael emerged from the house carrying 3 steaming mugs, handed one to Marcus, then sat in the chair next to him. Jimmy followed, leaning against the porch railing, his own mug cradled in his weathered hands. You know what I remember most about you, sir? Michael said, staring out into the darkness. Not the stories about your tactics or your leadership. What I remember is how Dad would talk about the way you'd sit with your men after tough missions, how you'd listen to them, really listen, how you made sure they knew their lives mattered more than any objective. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, letting the familiar taste ground him in the moment. "That man died in Kandahar," he said quietly. "Did he?" Jimmy challenged. "Or did you just bury him under expensive suits and corporate acquisitions? Because I've been watching you, Marcus Sterling. Behind all the hostile takeovers and ruthless business moves, you still look out for your people. Your company has the best veteran hiring program in the tech industry. Your foundation funds PTSD research. You've set up scholarship programs for military families." Marcus stared into his coffee cup, watching the steam rise in the cool night air. "That's just good PR," he said. But the words sounded hollow even to him. "Is it?" Michael asked. "Or is it Staff Sergeant Sullivan finding ways to complete his mission, even through Marcus Sterling's resources?" The question hung in the air, accompanied by the symphony of night insects and the distant rustling of cornfields. Marcus thought about his life, about the empire he'd built. Every victory, every acquisition, every billion added to his net worth had been an attempt to prove something. But to whom? The dead? Himself? "I don't know how to be both," he finally admitted. "I don't know how to reconcile the man who chose his men over the mission with the man who destroys companies for profit. I don't know how to be both Sullivan and Sterling." "Maybe you don't have to be both," Jimmy suggested, his voice gentle. "Maybe you just need to be yourself, all of it, the soldier and the businessman, the leader and the strategist. Maybe the real weakness isn't in showing humanity, but in denying it." Marcus stood up abruptly, moving to the edge of the porch. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of his Bentley, a shadow among shadows. "You know what the hardest part of being Marcus Sterling is?" he asked, not turning around. "The loneliness. In the military, everything we did as a team. But I built my empire alone, trusting no one, letting no one in. Because letting people in means risking loss, and I'd already lost too much." "Looks to me like you lost more by keeping people out," Michael observed quietly. Marcus turned back to face them, these two men who represented everything he'd tried to forget. "That day in Kandahar," he said, "when I chose to save my men instead of completing the mission, it wasn't really a choice at all. I couldn't sacrifice my team. They were more than soldiers to me. They were family. And when Thompson and Rodriguez died saving me, I convinced myself I didn't deserve another family, that I'd failed them by being human instead of being perfect." "Perfect gets people killed," Jimmy said firmly. "Human keeps them alive. You taught me that, sir. Maybe it's time you remembered it yourself." The night seemed to hold its breath as Marcus processed these words. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, a lonely sound in the darkness. But here on this porch, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the possibility of his future, Marcus Sterling didn't feel lonely at all. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The grandfather clock in Jimmy's living room struck 10, its deep chimes echoing through the farmhouse. Marcus glanced at his phone out of habit. Still no signal, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel that familiar surge of anxiety about being disconnected. Instead, he felt something else. Peace, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. "Your team," he said suddenly, looking at Jimmy. "The ones who made it out of Kandahar. What happened to them?" Jimmy set his empty coffee mug aside. "Martinez runs a successful construction company in Texas, specializes in hiring vets. Wilson became a high school teacher in Oregon. Chen's a trauma surgeon in Chicago." He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "They all asked about you over the years. None of them blamed you for leaving, you know. They understood what that day cost you." Marcus absorbed this information, each name bringing back a flood of memories. Martinez's terrible singing on long patrols, Wilson's endless supply of bad jokes, Chen's steady hands patching them up after rough missions. They'd been more than a team. They'd been a family. "They knew?" he asked. About Marcus Sterling? They figured it out. Same as I did, Jimmy replied. Hard to miss your face when it started showing up on magazine covers. But they respected your choice to stay away. Figured you had your reasons. Michael shifted in his chair. They're having a reunion next month, he said casually. First time in 15 years the whole team will be together. Well, almost the whole team. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. A reunion? Dad's been organizing it, Michael continued. Here, at the farm. Martinez, Wilson, Chen, they're all coming. Even some of the support staff from the base. People who served with you, who knew who you were before. He gestured vaguely at Marcus's expensive suit. Is that why you chose now? Marcus asked Jimmy. To bring me here? Jimmy nodded slowly. Seemed like it was time. 15 years is a long time to run from yourself, sir. And watching you from afar, seeing glimpses of Sullivan and Sterling's actions, I knew you were ready, even if you didn't. Marcus stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. His reflection looked back at him, and for the first time in years he really saw himself. Not the carefully crafted image of Marcus Sterling, but the man underneath. The soldier, the leader, the human being. What if I'm not ready? He whispered. What if I can't be who they remember? They don't expect you to be who you were, Michael said firmly. They just want you to be who you are. All of it. The good, the bad, the complicated parts in between. That's what family does. Family. The word echoed in Marcus's mind. He'd spent 15 years building walls, creating a fortress around himself where nothing could hurt him. But what had it cost him? What had he lost in the process? Your company, Jimmy said, as if reading his thoughts. Sterling Innovations, the veteran hiring program, the PTSD research, the scholarships. That wasn't just PR, was it? That was you trying to make amends, trying to complete the mission in your own way. Marcus turned back to face them. Every success, every acquisition, every bit of power I gained, I told myself it was about proving I could be strong, that I could make the hard choices. But maybe, he paused, the truth finally crystallizing in his mind. Maybe it was about trying to save people in a different way, not with tactics and strategies, but with opportunities. Second chances. Like the second chance you never gave yourself, Michael observed quietly. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about all the decisions he'd made as Marcus Sterling, all the companies he'd acquired and reformed. How many of those choices had been driven not by cold business logic, but by that same instinct that had made him save his men in Kandahar? The startup I acquired yesterday, he said slowly. The young CEO who begged me to spare his company culture, to keep his team together. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time in years. I saw myself in him. The way I used to be, caring about people more than profits. And what are you going to do about it? Jimmy asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus pulled out his phone, staring at the no signal indicator. When I get back to civilization, I'm going to call my board. Tell them we're not dismantling the startup's team. We're going to preserve their culture, integrate them properly. He looked up at Jimmy and Michael. And then I'm going to start preparing for a reunion. The clock chimed again, marking the quarter hour. Outside, the night had grown deeper, but inside, something was becoming clearer. Marcus Sterling hadn't killed Staff Sergeant Sullivan. He'd just buried him under layers of expensive armor. Maybe it was time to let both men exist together, to find strength in the vulnerability he'd spent so long running from. The following morning found Marcus sitting at Jimmy's worn kitchen table, his jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. His phone lay forgotten beside a plate of homemade breakfast. Real eggs, bacon, and biscuits that put his usual protein-optimized breakfast smoothies to shame. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light on a scene that felt simultaneously foreign and deeply familiar. Your car's fixed, Michael announced, walking in from outside, wiping his hands on a rag. Just needed to reconnect what we disconnected. He shared a knowing look with his father. You're free to head back to your world whenever you want. Marcus nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, he pulled out his leather portfolio, the one that usually held merger documents and acquisition plans, and opened it to a fresh page. Tell me about everyone, he said. The team. What they're doing now. Everything. Jimmy settled into a chair across from him, cradling a coffee mug. Well, Martinez, you remember how he always talked about building things? Turns out he was serious. His construction company specializes in sustainable housing. They've built over 3,000 homes for veterans and their families. Marcus started writing, his Mont Blanc pen moving across the paper. And he hires vets? Exclusively, Michael confirmed. Says it's about giving them a chance to build something instead of destroying things. They've got projects in 12 states now. Wilson's teaching high school history, Jimmy continued. But that's not all. He started a program helping kids from military families adjust when their parents deploy. Uses his own experience to help them cope. The school board's looking to expand it nationwide. Marcus kept writing, each detail a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was trying to solve. And Chen, the surgeon? Leading a trauma unit in Chicago, Michael said. But he also runs a free clinic for vets who can't afford medical care. Works there every weekend, no charge. Says he's still patching up his brothers, just in a different way. Marcus looked down at his notes, seeing not just facts, but a pattern. Each of his former team members had found a way to continue serving, to keep making a difference. They hadn't run from their past. They'd built on it. I want to help, he said suddenly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Not just attend the reunion. I need to do more. Jimmy leaned forward. What are you thinking, sir? Marcus began writing faster, years of business strategy merging with something deeper, something that felt more like his old mission planning. Martinez needs funding to expand his housing projects. Sterling Innovations has a real estate division. We can provide capital, resources, connections. Wilson's program. My foundation can help take it national, set up scholarships for the kids. And Chen's clinic ... He looked up, a familiar light in his eyes. We have a healthcare technology subsidiary developing AI diagnostic tools. We can provide equipment, support, make it a model for veteran healthcare nationwide. Sounds like a mission plan, Michael observed with a slight smile. It is, Marcus replied, continuing to write. But this time, the objective isn't just about completing a task. It's about rebuilding connections, making things right. He paused, then added another note to his paper. And the startup from yesterday, the one I was going to dismantle, their technology. It could help with all of this. Instead of absorbing them, we'll partner with them. Let them keep their team, their culture. Make them part of something bigger. Jimmy watched him with knowing eyes. Seems like Marcus Sterling and Staff Sergeant Sullivan might work pretty well together after all. Marcus sat back, looking at the pages of notes he'd written. In his usual business planning, everything was about efficiency, profit margins, market dominance. But this felt different. It felt like coming home. The reunion, he said, looking at Jimmy. How many are coming? 15 so far, Jimmy replied. Plus families. About 40 people total. Marcus nodded, making another note. I'll have my team set up accommodations in town, and transportation for anyone who needs it. But the reunion itself stays here at the farm. This place. He gestured around the kitchen. This is where it needs to happen. You sure you're ready for this? Michael asked. Once you step back into their lives, there's no going back to being just Marcus Sterling. I'm not sure of anything, Marcus admitted. Except that I'm tired of running. Tired of pretending that part of my life didn't exist. Tired of... He paused, searching for the right words. Tired of being half of who I am. The morning sun had climbed higher, and somewhere outside, a rooster crowed, a sound so far removed from the urban soundtrack of Marcus's usual life. Yet somehow, sitting in this farmhouse kitchen, making plans to bridge the gap between his past and present, he felt more at peace than he had in 15 years. 1 month later, Jimmy's farm had transformed. Not in its essence. The old farmhouse still stood proud and weathered, the fields still rolled golden toward the horizon, but in the energy that now filled it. Tents had been set up in the backfield, not the luxury structures Marcus had initially proposed, but simple military-style setups that felt right for the occasion. The barn had been cleaned out and converted into a gathering space with long tables and strings of lights that gave it a warm, welcoming glow. Marcus stood at the edge of the property, watching the first vehicles approaching down the dusty road. He'd arrived early, helping Jimmy and Michael with the final preparations. Gone was his usual tailored suit. Instead, he wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, clothes that felt foreign and familiar at the same time. "You ready for this, sir?" Michael asked, coming to stand beside him. Marcus took a deep breath. "No," he admitted. "But I'm here anyway." The first car pulled up, and Martinez stepped out, older, grayer, but with the same wide grin Marcus remembered. He stopped short when he saw Marcus, recognition and surprise crossing his face. "Staff Sergeant Sullivan," Martinez said, then corrected himself. "Or should I say Mr. Sterling?" "Mike," Marcus replied, his voice rough. "Just Mike is fine." They stood there for a moment, 15 years of distance stretching between them. Then Martinez stepped forward and pulled Marcus into a bear hug. "About damn time, sir," he said gruffly. More vehicles arrived. Wilson, now with streaks of gray in his hair but still with that mischievous glint in his eye. Chen, wearing his surgeon's confidence like a familiar coat. Each arrival brought another wave of memories, another piece of Marcus's past clicking back into place. The initial shock of his presence gave way to something else. Acceptance, understanding, and a gradual warming that felt like thawing after a long winter. They gathered in the barn where Jimmy had set up photos from their deployment, moments frozen in time, showing younger versions of themselves in a different world. "Remember this?" Wilson asked, pointing to a photo of their team outside their barracks. This was right before that mission in the mountains, the one where Martinez wouldn't stop singing that awful country song. "Hey, that song got us through 12 hours of patrol," Martinez protested, grinning. Marcus found himself drawn into the conversations, the memories, but he also noticed something else. The way his old team had evolved, grown. They weren't just dwelling in the past, they were building futures. Martinez talked about his construction projects, the families they'd helped. Wilson shared stories about his students, the children of soldiers finding their way. Chen spoke of lives saved, both in his hospital and his veterans clinic. As the evening progressed, Marcus stood up, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. The conversations quieted, all eyes turning to him. This wasn't like addressing his board of directors or giving a keynote speech at a tech conference. This was harder, more real. 15 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I made a choice in Kandahar. A choice to save my men instead of completing the mission. Then I made another choice, to run from who I was to become someone else entirely." He paused, looking around at the faces of his former team. "I thought I was running from weakness, from failure. But being here, seeing all of you, what you've built, what you've become, I realize I was wrong." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've spent the last month working with my company's legal team. As of yesterday, Sterling Innovations has established a new division, the Sullivan Foundation. Its mission is to support veteran-led initiatives across the country. Martinez, your housing projects will be the first recipients. Wilson, we're taking your program national. Chen, your clinic is getting all the equipment and support it needs." The barn fell silent. Marcus continued, "But more than that, I want you all involved. Not just as recipients, but as leaders. This isn't about Marcus Sterling trying to buy redemption. It's about Staff Sergeant Sullivan finally completing his mission, taking care of his men, making a difference, but this time with resources I never had before. Jimmy stepped forward. "The prodigal son returns," he said softly, but his eyes were proud. "No," Marcus corrected. "Not returning. Finally figuring out how to be whole. Marcus Sterling's resources and Staff Sergeant Sullivan's heart. Together, maybe we can do some real good." The silence broke then, replaced by a surge of voices, questions, ideas. Martinez was already talking about expansion plans, Wilson about program structures, Chen about medical technology needs. The energy in the barn shifted from reminiscence to possibility, from past to future. As Marcus looked around at his former team, his family, now engaging with both sides of who he was, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Purpose. Not the driven, relentless purpose that had built his empire, but something deeper, more meaningful. The Medal of Honor still hung in Jimmy's living room, but it no longer felt like an accusation. Instead, it had become a bridge between two worlds, two identities, two ways of serving. Marcus Sterling hadn't killed Staff Sergeant Sullivan after all. He'd just given him new weapons to fight with, new ways to complete the mission. The reunion stretched late into the night, with stories flowing as freely as the coffee Jimmy kept brewing. The barn's string lights cast a warm glow over the gathering, making the space feel intimate despite its size. Marcus found himself moving between conversations, catching up on 15 years of life with the men who had once trusted him with their lives. "You know what's funny?" Chen said, as they sat at one of the long tables. "All these years we've been following your career, watching you build this huge tech empire. And every time we saw you make some big acquisition or launch some new project, we'd say to each other, 'That's our CO, always thinking 3 steps ahead.'" Martinez nodded from across the table. "Remember how you used to plan our missions? Every detail, every contingency, but always with one priority, bringing everyone home. When we saw your veteran hiring program, we knew you were still trying to bring everyone home, just in a different way." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "I thought I was running away," he admitted, "trying to be someone else entirely. But I guess Staff Sergeant Sullivan kept finding ways to surface, even when Marcus Sterling tried to bury him." "You can't run from who you are," Wilson said quietly. "Trust me, I tried after Kandahar, tried to forget everything that happened there. But then I realized, those experiences, they made me who I am. They gave me the tools to help these kids I work with now. The tough ones, the ones dealing with deployed parents, with loss, with change. I understand them because of what we went through." The conversation was interrupted by Michael, who approached with a small wooden box. "Dad thought it was time for this," he said, placing it on the table in front of Marcus. Jimmy appeared behind his son, nodding encouragingly. Marcus opened the box slowly, already knowing what he would find inside. The Medal of Honor gleamed in the dim light, its blue ribbon slightly faded, but still proud. "It's yours," Jimmy said simply. "Always has been. Been keeping it safe until you were ready to carry it again." Marcus lifted the medal carefully, its weight familiar in his hands. "I don't know if I deserve this," he said softly. "That day in Kandahar," Martinez spoke up, "when the building was coming down, when Thompson and Rodriguez—" He paused, letting the names hang in the air for a moment. "You had a choice. Complete the mission or save your men. You chose us. Then you carried the weight of that choice for 15 years. The medal isn't just for what you did that day," Chen added. "It's for everything that choice represented. Leadership, sacrifice, humanity." Marcus looked around the barn at the faces of his former team. No, his family. Each of them had taken different paths after Kandahar, but none had run from who they were. They'd built on their experiences, used them to help others, to make a difference. Standing up, Marcus walked to where his leather portfolio lay. He pulled out a stack of documents, not the final papers for the Sullivan Foundation, but something more personal. "I've been working on something else this past month," he said, returning to the table. "I'm changing my name. Legally. Not back to Sullivan. Can't erase Marcus Sterling completely, but I'm adding to it. Marcus Sullivan Sterling. Because it's time to stop pretending these are two different people." The men around the table nodded in understanding. This wasn't just about a name, it was about acceptance, about integration, about finally being whole. "And there's more," Marcus continued. "The tech startup I almost dismantled the day my car broke down? They're now leading our veteran support technology initiative. Their team culture, the one I was going to destroy. It reminds me of us, of how we were in Afghanistan. They care about each other, work for something bigger than themselves. That's not weakness. That's their strength." The night had deepened outside, but no one seemed ready to leave. Plans were being made. Martinez talking about training programs for veteran builders, Wilson discussing online platforms for his student support system, Chen outlining telemedicine possibilities for remote veteran care. Marcus listened, adding suggestions, connecting dots, bringing together the strategic thinking of Marcus Sterling with the leadership of Staff Sergeant Sullivan. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, Jimmy gathered everyone for a final cup of coffee. Standing there, surrounded by his past and his present, Marcus felt the weight of the Medal of Honor in his pocket. But it no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a reminder that strength comes in many forms, that leadership means making hard choices, and that sometimes the longest journey leads you right back home. "To Thompson and Rodriguez," someone called out, raising their cup. "To Thompson and Rodriguez," the group echoed, Marcus's voice joining theirs. As the sun rose over Jimmy's farm, casting long shadows across the fields where Marcus had first confronted his past, he realized something. His car breaking down hadn't been an accident or a trap. It had been a gift. A chance to stop running, to bring together all the pieces of who he was, to finally complete the mission he'd started 15 years ago in Kandahar. The mission wasn't about military objectives anymore. It was about building bridges, healing wounds, and creating something meaningful from the choices that had shaped him. Marcus Sullivan Sterling raised his coffee cup one more time, surrounded by the family he'd nearly lost, ready at last to be exactly who he was, all of it, the soldier and the businessman, the leader and the human being, the past and the present united at last. 1 year later, Jimmy's farm was hosting another gathering. The old barn, now renovated but still maintaining its rustic charm, was filled with people again. But this time, it wasn't just Marcus's old military unit. The space was shared by veterans, tech entrepreneurs, and families from all walks of life. On a newly constructed stage, Marcus stood before the crowd, wearing a suit that somehow looked different on him now, less like armor and more like simply clothes. The Medal of Honor hung proudly on his chest, no longer a burden, but a bridge between his two worlds. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed audience, "my car broke down on that road out there." A gentle ripple of knowing laughter spread through the crowd. "Or rather, my old friend Jimmy Cooper made it break down." He gestured to Jimmy, who raised his coffee cup with a grin. "That breakdown led me to a discovery that changed everything. It forced me to confront who I was, who I'd been running from, and who I could become." Marcus paused, looking around the barn. "Today, we're here to celebrate what that moment started. The Sullivan Foundation's first year has helped fund the construction of over 500 homes for veteran families through Martinez Construction." Martinez stood up from his seat, acknowledging the applause. His company had grown exponentially, but he still personally oversaw every veteran hiring decision. "Wilson's military family support program has expanded to 300 schools nationwide." Wilson smiled from where he sat with a group of teenagers, children of deployed soldiers who had found hope and understanding through his program. "And Chen's veteran healthcare initiative has opened 15 new clinics, with more on the way." Chen nodded, his surgeon's hands wrapped around a coffee mug identical to the ones they'd used during late-night mission planning sessions years ago. But today isn't just about celebrating success, Marcus continued. It's about acknowledging that strength comes in many forms, that sometimes the hardest missions aren't the ones we face in combat, but the ones we face within ourselves. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, the same one he'd seen on Jimmy's wall that first night. "Thompson and Rodriguez," he said softly, holding up the photo. "They gave their lives saving mine in Kandahar. For years, I thought I had to choose between honoring their sacrifice and moving forward with my life. I thought being strong meant being hard, being ruthless." The barn was completely silent now, every face turned toward him. "I was wrong," Marcus said. "Real strength is about integration, bringing together all the parts of who you are, the soldier and the civilian, the leader and the follower, the past and the present." He gestured to the back of the barn, where computer screens showed real-time data from the Foundation's projects. Marcus Sterling's resources and Staff Sergeant Sullivan's heart, together they've accomplished more in 1 year than either could have done alone. Michael Cooper stepped onto the stage, now wearing captain's bars on his uniform. "The Foundation isn't just about building houses or funding clinics," he added. "It's about rebuilding connections, restoring faith, and reminding everyone that no soldier ever has to fight alone." As the applause died down, Marcus made one final announcement. "Today, we're breaking ground on the Thompson-Rodriguez Memorial Center. It will be a place where veterans can find support, where families can heal, where the past and present can meet to build a better future." The ceremony continued, but Marcus found himself stepping outside for a moment. The autumn air was crisp, just like it had been that night a year ago. His Bentley was parked in the same spot where it had broken down, but now it wore a different license plate. SULL-STRG. Jimmy joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of coffee. Black. 2 sugars. Just like always. "You did good, sir," he said quietly. Marcus looked out over the farm, where construction equipment stood ready to begin work on the new center. In the distance, he could see the road where everything had changed, where a broken-down car had led to a rebuilt life. "We did good," he corrected. "All of us. The mission isn't over, but for the first time in 15 years, I know exactly who's executing it." As they stood there, the sound of laughter and conversation drifted out from the barn. Inside were the people who had been part of his past, those who were part of his present, and those who would be part of his future. No more walls between them, no more running, no more hiding. Marcus Sullivan Sterling took another sip of his coffee, feeling the weight of the Medal of Honor on his chest. No longer a burden, but a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the longest road leads you right back home, and sometimes the greatest strength comes not from denying who you are, but from finally, fully embracing it. The sun was setting over Jimmy's farm, casting the same long shadows it had that first evening. But this time, Marcus wasn't lost. This time, he was exactly where he needed to be.